Welcome, everybody. My name is Esther Lee, the president of Chinese American Heritage Foundation. Our panel discussion today is Breaking the Law Barrier, Hon Yeng Chang, our first Chinese lawyer in the US. We are honored to have three distinguished guests, but let me introduce you guys our moderator first. Frank Wu, president of Queens College, and he is the first Chinese American law school dean in the US. Frank Wu served as the 11th president of Queens College. Prior to joining the City University of New York system, Frank served as chancellor and dean, and then William Pauser, distinguished professor at University of California, Hastings, College of the Law in San Francisco, a unique standalone institution, the original law school of the UC system. Before joining UC Hastings, he was a member of the faculty at Howard University, the nation's leading historically Black college/university for a decade. For his advocacy work, he received the John Hop Franklin Award in 2020. Frank is the author of Yellow Race in America Beyond Black and White. Prior to his academic career, he held a clerkship with the late U.S. District Judge Frank Batistis in Cleveland and practiced law with the firm of Morrison and Foster in San Francisco. He received a BA from the Johns Hopkins University and a JD with honors from the University of Michigan. So without further ado, let me introduce Frank, and he is going to introduce our two guests.
Good evening, everyone. You know, we've lost the Attorney General. I assume he'll come back and it's just a technical glitch. So I'll start by introducing a friend and colleague, Gabriel Chin. He goes by Jack. And when the Attorney General is back, we'll introduce him properly. So Jack is the Edward L. Barrett Jr. Chair and Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at University of California, Davis. He regularly appears on the list of the most cited legal scholars. And oh, here's the Attorney General again. All right. He writes about criminal procedure, immigration, and Asian Pacific American legal history. His work with students includes persuading the Ohio legislature to ratify the 14th Amendment and persuading Kansas, New Mexico, and Wyoming to repeal anti-Asian alien land laws, and persuading the California Supreme Court to posthumously, meaning after death, admit an attorney to the bar after he was excluded because of race. That's what we'll be talking about today. A graduate of Wesleyan University and the University of Michigan and Yale law schools, before he entered academia, he clerked for U.S. District Judge Richard Match in Denver, and then practiced with the Legal Aid Society of New York and with the prestigious Skadden Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom firm. We'll hear from Jack in just a moment. Allow me to introduce the Attorney General, who has just rejoined. Hello, Attorney General. William Tong. He's the 25th Attorney General to serve the state of Connecticut. He assumed office in January of 2019, becoming the first Asian American elected at the statewide level there. As the son of immigrants who were small business owners, the Attorney General knows firsthand the constant pressure on families squeezed by healthcare and prescription drugs, rising utility costs, the high cost of housing and education, and so many expenses. Since taking office, the Attorney General has become a national leader on a range of issues. That includes the fight against the opioid crisis, championing strong legal action against manufacturers, distributors, and other bad actors that have created the problem. He's become a national leader on antitrust enforcement, pursuing strong actions against large corporations in the pharmaceutical and technology sectors that have abused their positions to put profits ahead of consumers. Prior to his election, the Attorney General worked as a litigator with private law firms for 18 years, then was elected as a state representative in the Connecticut General Assembly, a seat that he held for 12 years, where he was also chairman of the Judiciary and the Banking Committees. He resides in Stamford with his wife, Elizabeth, and their 3 children and 10 pets. So let's get started. We'll have a lively discussion. We will have time for questions. Please note that the Zoom has a question and answer box. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom, toward the right-hand side, you'll see it says Q&A. Please use that function, not the chat function. Use the Q&A function for your questions, and we'll have a lively discussion. Let's first start with Professor Gabriel Chin. Who was Hon Yeng Chang, and what does his case tell us about today?
Thank you, President Wu, for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I will say a few words about Hon Yeng Chang. It's the topic of this panel today, and he was the first Chinese-American lawyer in the United States, and he had a very interesting life. He came to the United States in the late 1870s as a member of the Chinese Educational Mission. And the Chinese Educational Mission was a program that the Chinese Empire sponsored to send young men, and they were men, not women, it was not a co-ed program, to Western universities to get Western educations. And the purpose of this was to create a cadre of individuals with Western legal training who could deal with the Western powers who had negotiated very harsh treaties with China. And so as a young person, this was Hon Yeng Chang's mission. He was sent to the United States, where he came to the New England area. And he prepped at Andover, and then he entered Yale College, had a great resume. After his sophomore year at Yale College, China terminated the Chinese Educational Mission program. He was recalled. But he had enjoyed his years in the United States, and he came back a couple of years later at his own expense and for his own purposes. He enrolled in Columbia Law School, from which he graduated in 1888. And at the time, the tuition at Columbia Law School was $150 a year, a bargain. Cost of education has changed since then. So Hon Yeng Chang is in the United States. He's graduated from law school, but he faces a situation as an Asian person that most immigrants didn't face. So as most of you know, I hope, starting in 1882, immigration of Chinese was prohibited. So how was he able to come? Well, even under the Asian exclusion laws, scholars and students were allowed to come. So he was admissible as somebody who was planning to go to Columbia Law School, and he came in. Nevertheless, there was another range of restrictions against Asian people in the United States. The primary one, the principal one, began in 1790 with the Naturalization Act of 1790, which limited naturalization to free white persons. And so as an Asian person, there was some doubt, and after 1882, an explicit bar on him being naturalized as an Asian person. That restriction was in place until 1952 in one way or another. So he's here, he has this great educational preparation to become a lawyer, but he can't become a citizen. And at the time, New York, Connecticut, most states in the United States required that you be a citizen to be admitted to the bar. If not a citizen, at least that you have started the process of becoming naturalized by, there was a court paper that you could file called a Declaration of Intent to Become a Citizen. And so you either had to be a citizen or declarant to enter a lot of professions, including the legal profession. And so he did two things. He wanted to practice law in New York, but he was Chinese. What does he do? Well, one thing that he does is that he obtains a naturalization certificate. Now, at the time, there's this law that says no Chinese person can be naturalized. There's also this general restriction that you have to be a free white person. But you see a lot of examples, including in Hon Yeng Chang's case, of judges who, for civil disobedience reasons, because they think that the law is only applicable to people, to Chinese who are not westernized. Perhaps they're corrupt, but for whatever reason, Hon Yeng Chang and some other people did get naturalization certificates from courts. The other thing that he did is that he was not, your typical immigrant. He was not your typical Chinese immigrant. He had these experiences with the children of other elite people. And his Yale College roommate was the son of the Speaker of the New York House of Representatives. And he was able to go through his friend to the lawmakers in New York and get them to pass a special law for him. So most people, you could only take the bar and be admitted if you're a US citizen. But Hon Yeng Chang could take the bar examination and be admitted even though he wasn't a citizen. So he took and he passed the New York bar. With some difficulty, he got admitted. And so he became the first regularly admitted Chinese American to any bar in the United States. And he practiced in New York for a little bit, but he wanted to go to California. I think for business reasons. He thought that he would have more opportunity in California because of the closeness, the proximity to China, and because of the larger Asian population in California. He got a job at a law firm that at the time was one of the largest law firms in San Francisco, and did a lot of business with Chinese clients. And he got the senior partner at this law firm to move that he be admitted to the California bar. And the law at the time permitted a member of the bar of another state who was a US citizen to waive in. They didn't have to take the California bar exam. Now you have to take the California bar exam. That's why I'm not admitted in California, even though I'm a professor at the University of California Law School. But back then you could waive in if you were admitted somewhere else. So he goes and they make this motion for him to be admitted, and the California Supreme Court in a written decision denies it. And they say, we see your naturalization certificate that says Hon Yeng Chang is made a US citizen, but it's void. It's absolutely worthless. It's not worth the paper it's printed on because the law is clear, Chinese can't be naturalized. And yes, you are a member of the New York bar, but our waive-in rule says you have to be a citizen. So we know that you're not a citizen because of your race, and because you're not a citizen, you can't be a member of the California bar. So they deny his admission in a published opinion. And so he had a great career afterwards. He did a number of things in the Chinese diplomatic service, mainly in North America. He worked in Canada. He went to, when he was at the Chinese legation in Washington, D.C., he attended the wedding of Woodrow Wilson's daughter at the White House. So he got to do some interesting things. He has a number of descendants or collateral relatives anyway in the Bay Area, including Rochelle Chong, who is a graduate of the University of California Hastings College of Law, where President Wu was once dean. And Ms. Chong was the first Asian American FCC commissioner, the first Asian American member of the California Public Utilities Commission. So he had a good life and successful descendants, but he never was admitted to the California bar. And my students at the University of California, Davis read about this case, thought it was unjust. And so in 2013, 2014, the Asian Pacific American Law Students Association at UC Davis decided to seek his posthumous admission to the California bar. I was their faculty advisor on the project. We got counsel, who was a partner in a big international law firm and had some good connections with the California Supreme Court. And we filed a motion to admit him posthumously. And we didn't know what was going to happen because the state bar had a policy against posthumous admission. They don't do it. That was their policy. And we didn't know what the California Supreme Court was going to do. We did know that things had changed since 1890 when he was denied admission to the bar, because there were several Asian American members of the California Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice, as well as other non-whites and female members, which is a very, very different scenario than the bar, than the court in 1890. And in March of 2015, the California Supreme Court granted our motion to posthumously admit him to the bar. And they wrote a long and thoughtful opinion which recognized the role that the California Supreme Court had played in discriminating against Asian Americans and other non-whites in the Jim Crow era in California. The last thing that I'll say about Hon Yeng Chang and his career is that there was a period of time in the late 1890s when the San Francisco Examiner wrote a series of articles about Hon Yeng Chang that said that he was involved in illegal admission of alien Chinese to the United States. It was an expose that said essentially that he was participating in smuggling. And the San Francisco Examiner at the time was a William Randolph Hearst paper, and it printed a lot of things that weren't true. So I don't know whether this was a real scandal or something fabricated, but assuming that he did, I wonder about it. I wonder about how it should make us think about this person. Because as a lawyer, I certainly feel obligated to obey the law myself, support the law, even if we don't agree with it. On the other hand, this was the law that he was defeating, the Chinese Exclusion Act, was a race-based segregation law. And there are a lot of people in the United States today, myself included, whose ancestors did not comply with the Chinese exclusion law and came as a paper son or paper daughter because they didn't feel that the law that excluded them solely on the basis of race had any moral purchase. And the Zoom background that you see behind me is Martin Luther King, of course, who the University of California Davis Law School's building is named after Dr. King. And in his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, he talked about the fact that he did not feel obligated to comply with segregation laws. And he said that he thought that laws that diminish the human spirit in that way do not call for our obedience. And so I find it difficult to criticize Hon Yeng Chang if in fact it's true that he was involved in bringing Chinese people to the United States unlawfully. So I hope that's a sort of basic introduction to Hon Yeng Chang's situation.
It's wonderful, Professor, that you and your students were able to right a wrong, even if generations later. Let's turn to the Attorney General for the contemporary perspective. What are the issues that Asian Americans now face, whether it's in the legal profession or in other professions? I know that now there are many, all of us have achieved positions of success, but yet there is still what some have called a bamboo ceiling and so many issues. What do you see out there from your perspective?
Oh, we're still fighting the same battles in many ways. Let me first say thank you to Esther and Wilson and the Chinese American Heritage Foundation for hosting this conversation tonight. It may be 10 pets, but there's a lot of fish in there, so it's not like 10 dogs and cats running around the house. There are 3 wild teenagers around here, so that tends to add to the chaos. Thanks for inviting me. I apologize. This is after dinner in the dining room, 8:20 p.m. So I hope you'll excuse the informality. And it's great to be with President Wu and Professor Chin and to talk about Hon Yeng Chang, who I learned about some time ago, and who I feel a certain kinship with because of his ties to Connecticut. I think a lot of people assume that all of us on the East Coast, at least, came through sort of more recent immigration patterns and movements, the later diaspora, right? And then people in California had a different experience. But we in Connecticut know that we had Chinese Americans studying at Yale and Chinese Americans fighting on behalf of the Union in the US Civil War, going back to the mid 1800s. And what strikes me about Hon Yeng Chang is he's from Guangdong. My father's from Guangdong. He went to Hartford Public High. That was my mom's first stop, Hartford Public High, when she came here in the early 70s. He had the privilege and honor of going to Andover. I had the privilege and honor of going to Andover. And so there are a lot of parallels there. Professor Chin went to Wesleyan, I should note, another Connecticut shout out. And it's incredible that he started his life and legal career from, the same places that I did and many of us have, and that he overcame tremendous challenges to be, and with political savvy, made it to the New York bar is an incredible story. And so in many ways, it's inspirational to stand on his shoulders and to be the beneficiaries of his courage and that he is our ancestor in the law. But then in a lot of ways, as you told the story, yes, I see it. I see someone in the chat saying Young Wing, also a Yale grad. Professor Chin, you wondered about the San Francisco Examiner's, expose on him and in immigration and a system of unjust immigration laws in this country and his origins. One has to wonder how far we've come. My dad, I've said it many times, came here on a tourist visa and overstayed his tourist visa. So at one point, he was what we would call today undocumented or illegal. And long story short, it was an act of extraordinary compassion and grace by, I'm a Democrat, it was a Republican president of the United States who heard my father's plea to be able to stay in this country, President Nixon, and my father had a chance to pursue his citizenship. I should note that I was the first American born in my family, that my parents were not yet citizens before I was born. And as you say the words, Professor Chin, naturalization, right? The questions around Hon Yeng Chang, who's a citizen, who's not a citizen, who's eligible to be a member of the bar, who's not eligible. I don't have to tell you that today, those questions still abound. And when the former president suggested that maybe we should try to expel American-born citizens of immigrant parents, so-called anchor babies, it occurred to me that I'm an anchor baby. And then when he said that we ought to consider denaturalizing American citizens, well, then he's talking about my parents and my grandparents and everybody who has made incredible sacrifices so I could be on this Zoom tonight. And so I feel both a kinship and a real tie to his legacy and a beneficiary of his legacy. But if he were here tonight sitting with us, I think he would be troubled by, he'd be inspired by how much progress we've made, and that Frank Wu is the president of Queens College. It's incredible, but he would also wonder why we haven't progressed further. And I think those are really fair questions. Let me just close by saying I think the people watching this Zoom and my co-panelists, I think all of us continue to experience racial discrimination and animus and barriers that, Frank, one has to wonder, how far up we need to climb before the bamboo ceiling is no longer there. It's still there. Apart from the racist taunts that I get on my Twitter feed, which comes with the job, being referred to as the Manchurian AG, regularly accused of being a member of the Chinese Communist Party when I was born in Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm an American, Jack, just about as American as anybody else. But still, people have a hard time seeing me in this role, picturing Chinese Americans in public service roles, in elected roles, as leading professors, as eminent academics and leaders of major institutions. And so we have a lot of work to do.
Thanks. Please, to the audience, feel free to use the Q&A function. We want to have a lively dialogue. Let me turn back to the professor, who I know has done such an extensive study of legal history. And so many of us, even Asian Americans ourselves, might not be aware of what it was like in the 19th century and early 20th century. Jack, you've looked at, for example, intermarriage, what was called miscegenation. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the rules, and I know you've done some work on that, and then alien land laws, which, even though the name refers to aliens, it applied to Asians who couldn't help but be aliens. Maybe you could explain just a little bit more about naturalization. You did touch upon that. And most recently, you wrote a fascinating article with one of your students about what you called the war on Chinese restaurants. Even though the food was so popular and remains the best-selling type of ethnic food in the nation, there's a really dark and tragic history there. So maybe, Jack, you could talk a little bit about how the specific case of one lawyer, it wasn't just a lawyer, it was also other professions and so much more, including segregation in the schools, where kids of Asian descent were treated as non-white, and that meant that they were put into their own schools. Why don't you share a little bit of that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Frank. So there was in the United States during the Jim Crow era, pre-1965 or whatever, a full system of Jim Crow for Asians, a full network of laws that were designed to subordinate Asians, like African Americans, but also to discourage their migration to the United States. And they worked hand in hand with the Chinese exclusion law, later the Asian exclusion laws, which were similarly designed to exclude Asians from the United States. And so there was a state-federal partnership, federal government doing the immigration stuff, states doing a bunch of other stuff, but they were consciously in relation to each other and had this shared purpose. So 15 states had laws prohibiting Asians from marrying whites. And I did a study of these, and not every state that prohibited blacks from marrying whites prohibited Asians from marrying whites. But every state, there was no state that prohibited Asians from marrying whites that didn't prohibit blacks from marrying whites. So the Asian prohibition is a subset. On the other hand, every state with more than, I think the number is something like 0.5%. Every state with any significant Asian representation that also had a law prohibiting blacks from marrying whites prohibited Asians from marrying whites. So in a to oversimplify, in a racist state that was sufficiently racist, they would prohibit blacks from marrying whites. If there were any significant number of Asians there, they also covered Asians by those laws. There were another 15 or so states, mostly overlapping with the states that prohibited interracial marriage, but not entirely, that prohibited not aliens from owning land. There were some that did that, but over time, most states allowed aliens to own land because they wanted to encourage European immigration. And if you say, oh, no, only citizens can own land, then other states that allow non-citizens to own land will get those desirable migrants. But to discourage Asian immigration, about 15 states prohibited not aliens, but aliens racially ineligible to citizenship. The magic phrase was aliens ineligible to citizenship. They couldn't own land. California, Oregon, Washington, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Idaho, the white Western Empire had these alien land laws that were designed to discourage Asian immigration. They also mostly had the miscegenation laws, and then there were a lot of laws like the Homestead Act, the Federal Homestead Act, free land to encourage migration, and that land was available to citizens or persons who had declared their intention to become citizens. And again, that's taking this first legal step. It wasn't just, I declare I'd like to become a citizen. It was going to court, taking an oath, filing a paper. Then you get this certificate that you've declared your intention to become a citizen. Those people could benefit from the Homestead Act. But the original Homestead Act in 1860 was vetoed by President Buchanan. And one of the reasons is, I don't want Chinese to be able to benefit from this. So in 1862, President Lincoln signed it, and it was clear that because Chinese couldn't become citizens and they couldn't therefore declare their intent to become a citizen, don't worry, they're not going to be participating in this. And so there were lots and lots of benefits and licenses and contracts that were available only to people who had declared their intention to become a citizen or were citizens. And in many of those, we see explicitly that the people drafting it say, we're putting this in race neutral terms, but don't worry, it's only going to affect Asians because everyone else can declare their intention to become a citizen. And in many other industries, my research is on this these days. In many other industries, there were concerted efforts to exclude Asians through these various mechanisms. And the Chinese restaurant industry was one of them. And it seems preposterous to say this now, because now, as President Wu mentioned, Chinese restaurants are the most popular form of ethnic food in the United States. There are plenty of towns that have one restaurant, and it's a Chinese restaurant or a Chinese American restaurant in certain small towns in certain parts of the country. They're everywhere. But back in the day, the unions, particularly the Cooks and Waiters Union, resented Chinese restaurants, which successfully competed with other restaurants and tended to have family members or individuals doing it. So they didn't hire a lot of white labor. And they were resented by white restaurant owners and white restaurant workers. And a number of methods were used to try to shut them down, including boycotts. Chicago passed a zoning ordinance that prohibited Chinese restaurants from certain parts of the city. There were Boston and a number of other places said we're not going to issue business licenses to Chinese restaurants anymore. We found hundreds of newspaper reports, or at least dozens of newspaper reports of the police saying we're going to closely inspect the Chinese restaurants and we're going to try and drive them out. And there were a number of laws that were at least proposed at the 1913 American Federation of Labor Convention. A resolution was adopted that said that every state should pass a law that prohibited white women from working in Chinese or Japanese restaurants. And the motivation was, the concept was that because of the ineradicable foreignness of Chinese people, this is a moral hazard. a moral and economic hazard to society. And so society would be better off if we suppressed the grave threat of Chinese restaurants. And the thing is, it's not just Chinese restaurants. I found in the congressional record the same kind of arguments about Chinese sailors, the same kind of arguments about Chinese fishers. And there just was a sense that I think we're seeing the remnants of today, the unfortunate remnants of today, that Chinese people, Asian people, just cannot assimilate, cannot become part of America. It's just like oil and water, they cannot mix. And so the best thing to do is just to keep them out. And that was striven for in many, many ways.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's turn back to the Attorney General. And we have a question in the chat about this. I'm going to build on that question. So what can be done now? There's so much during the pandemic that we've seen, the violent attacks, elderly, especially elderly women, being spit upon, shoved to the ground so their bones are broken, shoved in front of subway trains, stabbed, shot in Atlanta, 6 of 8 being killed by 6 of the 8 victims of a confessed serial murderer, being Asian women who he targeted during an evening, just going around to Asian-owned businesses. So we've seen this now. As a public official, what would you recommend? What should we do? What can we do? What are the effective advocacy tactics?
So there's a huge, thank you for that question. Obviously a big question. And there's a huge bucket of concrete law enforcement actions that we can take. The president passed the COVID-19 anti-Asian hate law, and state attorneys general, prosecutors, police officers, the FBI, all of us are focused on a number of strategies, including increasing reporting, prosecuting hate crimes, all of these strategies on the law enforcement side. Let me put that off to the side because that's a much longer discussion. And I don't really think that's what the question is asking. But 2 things I think are really important. One thing we've done in Connecticut, and that is we just passed a law to mandate the teaching of Asian American Pacific Islander history. Really important, an important step for our community to require that public schools in Connecticut teach the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in their teaching of American history and our important and vital role, so that important historical lessons like the story of Hon Yeng Chang, or the story of the Chinese Exclusion Act, or the story of Japanese internment are not lost to history, but are known and understood by students, and the complexity of those stories, right? The fact that, for example, Attorney General Earl Warren, later governor, later Supreme Court Justice, and lion of our civil rights evolution in this country, was largely responsible in part for the internment of Japanese Americans. So that history has to be told in diving into it and making sure that it's taught with all its complexities is incredibly important, so that people understand, right? The not just the role of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, but the history and legacy of racism and hate that has persisted for a very long time in this country. The other thing that I think is important is to lean in to being Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, lean into being a Chinese American. I do it all the time, and use whatever platforms each of us has to talk about our experience and to be visible. When people ask me in the middle of hate crimes and attacks on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders how it makes me feel, I say I still feel invisible, because to be an Asian American and Pacific Islander in this country is to be invisible. We are having a national conversation and reckoning around race. That conversation largely does not include us. And I once sat through a 3-hour-long presentation about the history of racism in this country and hate, directed only to about 18 attorneys general in the room. So it was just us. I was the only Asian American face in the room. After 3 hours, the presenter, an eminent scholar and lawyer, had to run to catch a plane. And I grabbed him and I said, "That was a great 3-hour presentation." He said, "Thank you, except for one thing." I said, "What?" He said, "What?" I said, "In that entire 3-hour presentation, you didn't once mention Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders." Imagine that. Over 3 hours, not one mention of Chinese Exclusion Act, of Japanese internment, of the beating death of Vincent Chin. How can you tell the story of race and racism in this country without those stories and without that history? So we need to become more visible by telling our history, by sharing our own personal histories. And let me just share this one anecdote. Amara Walker is a CNN correspondent, and she was walking through the international airport in New Orleans, and she suffered, some verbal attacks, and people went after her and made racist remarks about her. And this is a CNN correspondent, and a person with some celebrity, and people still felt privileged to say awful things to her. So she jumped on Twitter and explained how she felt during that experience, to herself be visible and shine a light on this hatred and discrimination and this racism. And as she explained what it was like for her as a Korean American born in this country, a native born American and a Korean American who grew up in America, she talked about how she felt as American as anybody else. And she wrote that she, as a Korean American, was as American as Korean barbecue. And I thought that was a beautiful way of putting it. And I grew up in a Chinese restaurant working side by side with my parents. I'm as American as shrimp fried rice. And we sold a heck of a lot of shrimp fried rice, man. And I think what that said to me is, there's no right way to be an American and no wrong way to be an American. And Professor Chin, it's not oil and water, it's all, I guess it's all one liquid. And I believe very strongly that we need to claim our place in America and American history and American society by believing and proclaiming once and for all that we're as American as anybody else. And that involves being visible, leaning into it, and calling it out.
Thank you so much. I am monitoring all the questions in the Q&A, so I'm putting those in front of our presenters, and I'm going to build on one that was asked by Andrew Chin. This is for Jack. I'm persuaded by what you say. I'm persuaded by what William Tong has to say as a leading, prominent attorney general and in his state, someone who's won office. So I'm persuaded. But what about folks who aren't persuaded? So there's a lot of backlash right now against what they call critical race theory, and you've been identified as maybe someone who is a critical race theorist. And it's not just from the sources you might think. They're actually Asian Americans, Asian immigrants in particular, who have said, I don't want my children being taught about critical race theory. I've even heard every now and then from some Chinese immigrants who have said, well, the folks who were coming before, they weren't strong enough, and we need to be strong. And they've said, now that China is strong, we're going to be strong. And they don't want to hear stories of what they would perceive of as weakness. So what would you say to our friends, including Asian Americans who don't like this history being taught, or who think there's a problem when this is discussed?
So I think what a lot of people I've heard these stories about critical race theory, about teachers making students sit in different parts of the room and telling them that that their parents are awful or something like that. And that's not what I think of with critical race theory. What I think of with critical race theory is history. History, political science, legitimate research and facts. And if it's not good, then it's not good. But I think if we take seriously the idea to understand what happened in the past, that it's useful to do that, then I think the backlash against critical race theory is understandable but unfortunate. And it's understandable because there's this myth that you see from scholars and academics like Nathan Glazer, a critic of affirmative action, at least at one point, like Justice Scalia, and they have this myth that their Jewish, Italian, Irish ancestors immigrated to the United States and didn't get anything, and worked their way up and had to earn everything that they had, and were looked down upon by the Yankees, and they didn't benefit from any of them. They didn't own slaves or anything like that. And that story overlooks the systematic cash money benefits, like the Homestead Act, like all white unions, like the structure of the New Deal, which was designed to help the white working class and overlook the Latino and Black working class, like the segregated military up until 1948, like housing segregation and public housing segregation and government financed housing segregation, not to mention school segregation, the dozens and dozens of ways, the systematic ways in which the white working class was given its taste at the expense of non-whites, particularly African Americans, particularly Latinos and Native Americans, but Asian Americans were also excluded from a lot of these opportunities. And if you, on the one hand, see yourself as having done it all by yourself, nobody ever gave me or my parents or my grandparents anything, but in fact, you were given a ton of stuff, that's a very unpleasant message to hear, but it's the reality. And so I think that's the explanation for this anger and resentment at critical race theory. The economic discrimination in favor of whites and against non-whites that existed up until the 1970s or 80s is so pervasive that it's very difficult and unpleasant for people to think about.
Thank you. So let's talk about practical measures today. If I could ask William, how do we build bridges to other communities, to other allies? And at an individual level, there's a question in the chat, actually from a very distinguished guest, Bill Chen, who's a retired United States Army general. And he asks, should we urge Asian Americans to integrate and assimilate as opposed to diversity and multiculturalism? So I'll pose those two questions to you. The first is, how do we build bridges? Can we, and how's that done to whites, to Blacks, to whoever would help us? And should we, can we, must we assimilate more or be more multicultural? I'll confess right now, I'm a Chinese school dropout, and my Mandarin is weak at best. I can fake it when called upon to do so. And in some ways, I know that even though I've achieved professional success, I've disappointed my parents in some of the choices I've made.
Well, my Mandarin and my Cantonese are weak, and I would say that I disappoint myself as much as I disappoint anybody else.
Yes.
Let me just say a couple things in response to Professor Chen, and I'll turn to your question. You know, this whole idea about critical race theory, I'm just gonna be very candid, is a bunch of nonsense made up by the former president in the middle of a presidential campaign. The idea, okay, that race and racism infect every public and private institution in this country is not a new idea. It's not even a controversial idea. It's a fact. And how do I know? Because I learned it in high school 35 years ago. Okay, so let's just cut the crap. Okay, this is what it means to be in America and to grow up in America of whatever race and background you have. You experience the effects of this social, political, economic phenomenon, and it's a problem, and we have to overcome it. Until the last few years, that was not a controversial thought or statement. In terms of building bridges and assimilation, I have a very strong view of this, and I'll pick up on where I left off before. We have to stop pretending to be who we're not, okay, and trying to be somebody else. There are people, Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, who came to this country before us, who changed their names, who tried to anglicize their names. I had friends, when I first ran for office, newsflash, there aren't a ton of Asians in Connecticut. And I've won over and over again in this state. And I've been through 10 campaigns and won more than I lost. And there aren't a ton of Asian Americans. And I had a friend, a Korean American friend, tell me, maybe you should take your wife's name, she's white. Maybe you could run as William Hotchkiss. And I was like, why would I do that? And he said, well, maybe you can hide the fact that you're Asian. And I said, Peter, look at me. I'm quite sure they know. And so it is so much better to embrace who we are, that, I raise my bowl to my mouth with my chopsticks and push my rice into my mouth, right? That I celebrate Chinese New Year. That we, have certain cultural and family practices that other communities don't share. And it's a wonderful and beautiful thing. And here's what I've discovered in public life. The more I talk about my experience as the son of immigrants, the more I talk about my experience working side by side with my parents in our Chinese restaurant, and the more I talk about the fact that my dad was at one point undocumented, builds a basis for me to build bridges to other people. Because they say, oh yeah, I had the same experience. I had this same experience at the border. I visited the border in 2019 with about 20 other attorneys general. And I talked about my dad's story and how he came here on a tourist visa and overstayed his tourist visa. And as soon as I finished telling that story, the Attorney General of New Mexico, Hector Balderas, said, me too. My father ran over the border from Mexico illegally. And then the Attorney General of Illinois, Kwame Raoul, said, me too. My father's a physician, came here on a tourist visa, overstayed his welcome. You want to talk about building bridges, okay? The more you talk about who you are and what you're about and your experience, the more you will find that other people, including quote unquote white ethnic people, Italians, Irish, Jewish Americans, have very similar experiences. And it's through that you build coalitions and you can work together, for example, to get Hon Yeng Chang posthumously admitted to the California bar. You need other people to work with you to make these things happen. I must say, the idea of assimilation and integration, I don't know what that means, right? If it means being somebody who I'm not, that's not the right strategy.
Thank you so much. Hotchkiss, that's a fancy name.
Hey man, I'm telling you,
All right. We're about to wrap up. Let me turn to each of our panelists for some closing thoughts. Let's try to end on a positive note here. What would you recommend to our audience members as we celebrate Asian American Heritage Month? If you would just offer one thought, each of you, about how to achieve greater success, whether that's in their own professional careers or whether they pursue public life and civic engagement. What strategy would you offer, just in concrete terms? Let's start with Jack.
Is the question how to achieve more in your own personal career?
However you would frame it, whether it's success for the individual, for the family, for the community, whether it's private success, public success, whether you look at the lessons of history or what's going on now. What advice do you have based on everything that you've studied?
My personal view is that for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about in the last hour, that we have to, as Asian Americans, recognize our connection to and solidarity with certainly all other Americans, but other Americans of color. We would not have the opportunity to be in the United States, most of us, if it weren't for the civil rights leadership of African Americans that resulted in the Immigration Act of 1965. We have had the experience of immigration oppression, like Hispanic people. And I think we have to recognize that in different ways, in different forms, we've all been subjected to the same system of white supremacy, and we should oppose it, not only for ourselves, but also for other people.
Okay, and our Attorney General.
Yeah, and to acknowledge that is not to acknowledge weakness. I had to laugh when you said that there's some people who think that those of us or whose families came before were somehow weaker. You know, my parents, as I said, worked 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. They came to America, to all places, Hartford, Connecticut, by way of Hong Kong and Taiwan because they're running for their lives, you know, and they came here with nothing, 57 cents. My dad had 57 cents in his pocket when he arrived in Hartford, and there was nobody here for him. They were the first, they were the pioneers. And I don't know anybody stronger than them. And I think we should recognize and honor people for their sacrifices and how hard they have worked to come here, because you know, they didn't come in 2022, you know, with a strong economic China at their back. They came here with nothing, and made tremendous contributions to make our country great. Here's what I would say, though. For all of us who have done well, and we didn't get a chance to talk about the model minority myth, which is a corrosive indulgence that really hurts our community. For all of us who have done well, there are so many of us who have not. And too often on Zooms like this and in rooms like this, we have a professor and a college president. You forget about all the people who, Frank, downtown in the Bowery and Mount Street right now are working their asses off, and no one will ever see or hear from them. And there are people too. And I encourage everyone to think of them and to work hard to ensure that they have access to justice and opportunity, as we all have.
Both of you were so well spoken. Thank you. You've been inspiring. I know that I've learned a tremendous amount. I want to thank Esther and the Chinese American Heritage Foundation for bringing us together for a wonderful program. I'll turn it back over to Esther, but I want to thank both of our panelists, Professor Jack Chin, Attorney General William Tong. Esther, back to you.
Yep. Thank you so much. Attorney General Tong, every time when you speak, you always inspired me. I'm sure you inspire everybody. And thanks for your insight. And Professor Chang, thank you. With such a short time, you have a concise sharing on the research on Hon Yeng Chang, and I really appreciate that. And of course, Frank, you are the awesome moderator, and I know you are an awesome panelist too, so you can do both. So thank you so much for your time. Your time is precious. We learned so much from all of you, and I'm sure the attendees really appreciate, all your sharing and your insight and your thoughts. So everybody have a good night, and we have more webinar coming up. So please check our website, chf.us. Thank you. Thank you so much, Attorney General Tom, and again, Professor and President Frank.